October 1944. The waters off the Philippines. Time itself seems to be held captive in the pre-dawn haze. The air is thick, heavy, saturated with tropical humidity and the smell of salt. The Pacific Ocean, usually serene, feels like a tightly wound string. To the east, the sky is just beginning to lighten, painting the horizon in soft, watercolor tones. But this beauty is deceptive. It's the beauty of a katana blade just before it strikes. We are on the bridge of the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the battleship Yamato. Everything here breathes order, discipline, and an almost religious sense of its own superiority. Not a single wasted movement. The gleam of polished brass, the low hum of giant machines somewhere in the ship's steel belly, the faint crackle of radio equipment. This was not just a warship. It was a floating Shinto shrine, the pinnacle of engineering, encased in 70,000 tons of armor and imperial ambition. Its 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a ship, were silent idols, capable of hurling car-sized shells over 20 miles. On the bridge are the officers. Their white uniforms are spotless. Their faces are as unreadable as the ritual masks of a no-play. They are the elite, raised on the code of Bushido and the doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the belief in a single, decisive battle where spirit and superior weaponry would crush the enemy's brute force. They have prepared their entire lives for this moment, for this battle. A senior lookout, his eyes glued to a massive Nikon binocular, the best naval optics in the world, cuts through the reverent silence. His voice is calm, almost lazy. Targets sighted on the horizon, several flat-top silhouettes. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commander of the center force, steps forward. He is handed a pair of binoculars. For a few long, tense seconds, he studies the barely visible dots dancing in the morning haze. Then he lowers the binoculars, and the shadow of a smirk crosses his lips. "Carriers," he says, and the word is laced not with alarm, but with contempt. A ripple of restrained excitement spreads across the bridge. Other officers take turns at the optics. Their reaction is a mix of bewilderment and arrogance. What are these things? Merchant ships, crudely converted by amateurs? Their lines are clumsy. Their speed is pathetic. They leave ugly plumes of black smoke in their wake like cheap trucks. They don't stalk like predators. They crawl like a herd of frightened cattle. Is this what the Navy of a great power looks like? A junior officer can't help but let out a quiet snort. Another joins him. Soon, a low, confident, professional laugh rolls across the bridge. It's the laugh of master craftsmen looking at a student's prude project. They were looking at Casablanca-class escort carriers. Americans nicked them Jeep carriers. Their own sailors mockingly deciphered the hull classification, CVE, as combustible, vulnerable, expendable. To the Japanese officers, whose ships were works of art honed by years of painstaking labor, these American floating garages were an insult to the very idea of naval warfare. Their laughter was logical. It was justified. It was based on their entire experience, their entire philosophy. They saw steel, water, and weak targets. They did not see the most important thing. They did not know they weren't just looking at ships. They were looking at a ghost, the ghost of American industry. They saw a few vulnerable hulls, but they couldn't see the invisible assembly line stretching across the entire Pacific Ocean from the shipyards of California. Each of these ugly ducklings was not just a combat unit. It was a single cell in a gigantic, insatiable organism, the American war economy. It was the embodiment of a new philosophy of war, where victory belongs not to the most skilled swordsman, but to the one who can send 1,000 swordsmen into the field, and when they fall, send 10,000 more. The Japanese admirals saw easy prey. They saw glory. They did not understand that they were looking into the face of a new god of war, an assembly line god for whom ships were not masterpieces but consumables. The laughter on the Yamato's bridge dies down, replaced by professional commands. The giant gun turrets begin their slow, inexorable turn. The sea trembles in anticipation. The Japanese officers had prepared for a battle against a fleet. They had no idea they were about to fight a factory. In a few hours, no one would be laughing. There would be silence, and then disbelief and shock. To understand where this ugly ship came from, you have to travel from the sun-drenched waters of the Pacific to the icy darkness of the Atlantic in 1941. In those years, the Atlantic wasn't an ocean, it was a steel graveyard, a black hole into which the British Empire was pouring its resources, its hopes, and the lives of its sailors. German U-boats, Admiral Donitz's wolf packs, operated with ruthless efficiency. The problem was simple and devastating. In the middle of the Atlantic lay the air gap, a dead zone that land-based aircraft couldn't reach. The solution seemed obvious. The convoys needed their own air cover. They needed aircraft carriers. But America's fleet carriers were gods of war, complex, expensive, precious. So President Franklin Delano Roosevelt intervened. Legend says that at a meeting, frustrated with the bureaucracy, he grabbed a napkin and sketched a simple design: the hull of a cargo ship with a flat flight deck on top. That was it. It was a cry of desperation. The idea was passed to the Navy, and the naval architects were horrified. But Roosevelt wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for a solution, and he knew a man who thought the same way. His name was Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser wasn't a shipbuilder. He was a builder. His philosophy was brutally simple. If you can make it out of steel, you can mass produce it, fast, cheap, and in huge numbers. Kaiser was tasked with turning Roosevelt's frantic sketch into reality, and so the ugly duckling was born, the Casablanca-class escort carrier, and it was even worse than the pessimists had predicted. Let's just look at the cold, hard facts. Speed, 19 knots. 19! That meant the escort carrier couldn't run from anything. Armor, it was practically non-existent. Sailors called it Kaiser's tin. A torpedo would tear it in half. Size? The flight deck was a third shorter than a fleet carrier's. Air group? Just 28 planes. Early tests confirmed the worst fears. On similar, earlier models, the welded seams would crack under stress. The engines were unreliable. The interior was cramped, hot, and noisy. Even the British, who desperately needed these ships, looked at them with disbelief. This is when the famous nickname was born, CVE, combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. That last word was the most important. These ships were the ammunition of war. No one, not the admirals, not the engineers, not even the sailors who served on them, saw the seeds of victory in this ugly hybrid of a ship and a factory. They saw only a compromise born of desperation. But history was preparing to turn that compromise into a death sentence for an empire. No one knew it yet. While the naval academies in Annapolis and Tokyo were studying the works of Mahan and the Battle of Tsushima, the war was being won by another man, far from the ocean, Henry J. Kaiser. He looked at an aircraft carrier not as a weapon, but as a product. Traditional shipbuilding was an art. Kaiser looked at this process and said, "This is insane." He didn't build a ship, he assembled it. At Kaiser's shipyards in Richmond and Portland, there was only the roar of industry, a deafening, non-stop industrial rhythm. Kaiser had dissected the ship into hundreds of standardized modules. Thousands of workers, many of them farmers or housewives just weeks before, performed one simple, repetitive task. Giant cranes lifted 200-ton sections and placed them with surgical precision. The ship wasn't built up from a keel, it was assembled like a giant Lego set. The slipway had become an assembly line. This wasn't a navy, this was Detroit on the water. And now for the numbers, and they are more terrifying than any cannon. Japan's heavy carrier Taiho, the pride of the fleet, took 2.5 years to build. Soon, Kaiser's yards were launching one escort carrier every 3 weeks. In a single year, the yard in Vancouver, Washington alone built and launched 50 ships of this class. It was a flood, a steel avalanche. Over the course of the war, the United States built 122 escort carriers. Japan, with all its engineering genius, managed to build just 15 light and escort carriers. The enemy could sink 1 or 3, but they couldn't sink the American economy. For every ugly duckling sunk, 3 more were already crossing the Pacific, and 5 more were being painted in a California shipyard. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. Every hull launched was immediately met by the army of logistics. Trains carried fighters from Grumman factories. Pipelines carried fuel from Texas. Hundreds of newly trained pilots arrived from bases in Florida. Crates of standardized, interchangeable spare parts arrived from warehouses in Ohio. America wasn't just fighting with ships. It was fighting with an ecosystem. While a Japanese mechanic hand-tooled a single replacement part, an American mechanic simply threw out the broken engine and installed a new one. This was the industrial rhythm that the world would soon be forced to dance to. It was the rhythm of hammers, conveyors, and factory whistles. This sound, born thousands of miles from the front lines, was already rolling across the waves of the Pacific. The Japanese admirals couldn't hear it yet, but soon they would feel it. October 25, 1944, 6:45 a.m., the sea off the island of Samar. On the bridge of the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, the morning routine was underway. This was the flagship of Task Unit 77.4.3, which bore the jaunty call sign Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Their job was boring but essential: provide air cover for General MacArthur's invasion forces. Suddenly, the routine was shattered by a lookout's cry: unidentified ships on the horizon. Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Spragg, commander of Taffy 3, raised his binoculars. What he saw was impossible. On the horizon, silhouetted against the rising sun, was a wall of steel. The unmistakable pagoda-style superstructures of Japanese battleships. It was Admiral Kurita's center force, the main battle fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a force that could wipe them off the face of the ocean. And it was heading straight for them. It wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be an annihilation. There was nowhere to run. Their jeep carriers topped out at 19 knots. The Japanese cruisers were closing at 35. At 6:58 a.m., from a distance of 20 miles, the main guns of the Yamato spoke. Geysers of water erupted around the American ships. And in that moment, Admiral Sprague made a decision that defied every textbook on naval tactics. He gave the order to his tiny screen of escorts: attack. It was a mission with no return. 3 destroyers and 4 smaller destroyer escorts, tin cans as their sailors called them, turned and steamed towards the armada. It was the attack of gnats on a bull. The first to go was the USS Johnston. It charged the Japanese cruisers at full speed, laying a smokescreen. It raced through a wall of shell splashes, fired all 10 of its torpedoes, and crippled the heavy cruiser Kumano. In return, a storm of shells tore the ship apart. Behind it charged the others: the Howell, the Heermann, the Samuel B. Roberts. They went on desperate one-way torpedo runs against battleships, firing their tiny 5-inch guns. They were buying precious minutes. Meanwhile, from the decks of the ugly ducklings, a swarm was rising. The pilots of Taffy 3 took off with whatever they had and threw themselves at the enemy. For the Japanese, a nightmare was beginning. Admiral Kurita expected a panicked retreat. Instead, a pack of rabid dogs leaped at him from all directions. His powerful ships were forced to constantly maneuver. And the planes just kept coming. When bombs and torpedoes ran out, pilots were ordered to make dry runs, simulating an attack to force the Japanese ships to evade and waste ammunition. Confusion was turning to alarm on the Japanese bridges. Where were all these planes coming from? The ferocity of the attack was inconsistent with the pathetic group of ships they saw. Kurita began to believe the only thing that made sense. He had sprung a trap, that these small carriers were just the bait, and that somewhere, over the horizon, Halsey's main fleet was waiting. Shock and disbelief did their work. After 2.5 hours of hell, having lost 3 heavy cruisers, Admiral Kurita could take no more. At 9:11 a.m., he gave the order that would go down in history. All ships reverse course north, regroup. The Armada was retreating. On the bridges of the surviving American ships, there was silence. They had won. A handful of the most despised ships in the U.S. Navy had just stopped the most powerful battle fleet in the world. When the thunder of the guns off Samar faded, a deafening silence fell over the surviving American ships. They had survived. The price of this miracle was horrific. 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort were sunk or would soon go down. Nearly 1,000 American sailors were lost. Taffy 3 had been virtually wiped out. But it had stopped Kurita. While the Americans were counting their wounds, on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, steaming north, a different kind of collapse was taking place. An entire philosophy of war was crumbling. Admiral Kurita and his staff were in a state of profound shock. They had lost not to a fleet, but to their own imagination. The idea that such hell could be unleashed by a handful of expendable ships simply did not compute in minds trained to believe in the superiority of quality over quantity. They had prepared for a duel between swordsmen. Instead, they were simply buried in a rock slide. The true understanding came later, in the cold, quiet interrogation rooms after Japan's surrender. When American officers asked captured Japanese admirals what they believed was the decisive factor in their defeat, they kept hearing the same answer. One high-ranking officer said it with a tone of despair. "We were prepared to fight your warriors. We did not know how to fight your factories." There it was, the verdict. Japan had entered the war with arguably the world's best fighter plane, the Zero, and the most experienced pilots. The Imperial Japanese Navy was a nearly perfect instrument, honed, deadly, a work of art. But it was a finite, handcrafted instrument. America, when awakened, began to fight not with an army, but with its entire civilization. America became one giant, ruthless factory. And the symbol of this new, terrifying kind of war was not a majestic battleship. It was that ugly duckling, the escort carrier. It was never meant to be a masterpiece. It was a line item in a production schedule. Its strength was not in its armor or its speed. Its strength was in its numbers, in its replaceability. It was the physical embodiment of industrial might. It wasn't just a war machine. It was a stamped-out verdict, issued from an assembly line. It was an invoice delivered to the battlefield, and the line item for total read unlimited. The Japanese Navy did not lose because its warriors were inferior. It lost because it was fighting by the rules of honor and artistry in a world that had begun to live by the rules of statistics and mass production. A samurai sword, for all its beauty and sharpness, cannot parry the blow of a factory. It can block the first strike, and the second, and the 10th, but it will shatter against the 1,000th, and behind that, there will be 1,000,000 more. In the end, what won the battle off Samar wasn't a doctrine, it was logistics. The victor wasn't an admiral, it was a manager. The assembly line had won.